Tonight, let's settle in with a topic that's as universal as it is bizarre: sleep. But not just any sleep. We're diving into the nighttime world of medieval Europe, where shutting your eyes was anything but straightforward. Before we get too cozy, take a second to hit like and subscribe if my travels through history make your evenings any less confusing. And do me a favor, pop into the comments with your location and the current time. I love discovering which corner of the globe is tuning in, and which of you is bravely listening at 3 a.m. Instead of blackout curtains and white noise machines, let's set the mood, dim the candle, listen for the wind rattling the shutters, and imagine a world before electricity, bedtime podcasts, or the existential dread of blue light. In those days, medieval folks had a nightly routine that would leave any modern sleep coach speechless. It was called segmented sleep, a two-part system dividing the night like a loaf of bread that's seen better days. The procedure was straightforward, at least by medieval standards. As soon as the sun slipped away, most people would crawl into bed early, slipping into what they called first sleep. 4 hours or so later, they'd wake up on purpose, not because of anxiety or too many cups of ale, but because this was simply how sleep was done. Rather than tossing and turning, they filled this middle-of-the-night window known as the watch, with all sorts of activities. Think of it as a medieval version of multitasking, except instead of doom-scrolling, folks prayed, recited scripture, stoked fires, or checked if their goat had finally learned to respect property lines. The livestock check was crucial, sleep was important, but so was making sure your dinner didn't wander off in the moonlight. And for those wondering, yes, this was also prime time for intimacy. Medieval marriage guides and physicians assured everyone that, during the watch, the body was rested and the mind was serene, a gentle way of saying you were too groggy to argue about chores. So if you pride yourself on making your partner coffee at sunrise, know that your ancestors set a very different standard for romance. Once the watch wound down and all necessary tasks, spiritual, practical, or otherwise, were complete, everyone returned to bed for second sleep, which lasted until morning. This wasn't just a peasant quirk. Monks, farmers, and even medieval celebrities like Chaucer referenced this rhythm, which makes you realize that even the greats were up at night wondering if they'd ever get back to sleep. Oddly enough, modern science suggests segmented sleep might be a more natural fit for humans than our current obsession with 8 uninterrupted hours. Without artificial light, our bodies fall into a similar pattern. So next time you find yourself wide awake at 2 a.m., just whisper, the watch begins, and perhaps tend to your imaginary hearth instead of panicking about tomorrow's Zoom meeting. It was only with the arrival of the industrial era, with its gas lamps, roaring factories, and a newfound terror of wasted time, that we started demanding sleep in a single, unbroken block. In medieval Europe, waking up in the middle of the night wasn't a sign of failure or insomnia. It was the default, and everyone followed the script, for better or for itchier. Which brings us to the question, what exactly did people sleep on? Today we're spoiled with memory foam, cooling gels, and an endless debate about the perfect thread count. Medieval beds, if you could call them that, were more like a pile of ex-life pressed flat by generations of restless sleepers and unspoken regrets. The typical peasant bed was a straw mattress, known as a pallet, which was literally just straw or hay stuffed into a bag, assuming you had a bag. No bag? Just dump the straw on the floor and hope for the best. If you were lucky, the family cat had already claimed the warmest spot. These pallets offered insulation against the cold, but were also prime real estate for insects, lice, and the occasional mouse. If it itched, you ignored it. If it bit, you shifted an inch and prayed for mercy. For those with a bit more coin, or at least a healthy back, you might hoist your pallet onto a wooden frame. This didn't exactly revolutionize comfort, but it did make it slightly less likely you'd wake up face to face with a beetle. Linen sheets were a luxury most could only dream about. Pajamas, as we know them, were a fantasy. Instead, people slept in the same clothes they'd worn all day, and personal space was about as common as a hot bath. Entire families, parents, children, the odd grandparent, often shared not just the same room but the same straw pile. If you needed more warmth, you simply rolled closer to your cousin's elbow and hoped for the best. Nobles, naturally, experienced sleep on a grander scale. Think massive carved wooden beds, feather mattresses, ornate embroidered sheets, and canopies designed to keep out both the chill and any adventurous lice. These beds were so valuable that they often showed up as prized inheritances. Forget land, you wanted your late aunt's suspiciously lumpy feather bed. But for most medieval people, a bed wasn't a haven of luxury. It was a bulwark against frostbite, a barricade from chickens, and the setting for dreams of someday sleeping on something that neither rustled nor squawked. Now, when we think of a nightcap, maybe you picture a cozy drink by the fire, whiskey perhaps, and a questionable choice or two. But in medieval times, a nightcap meant exactly what it sounded like, a hat, a real, tangible, sometimes ludicrously pointy hat, whose entire purpose was to keep your head attached to your body temperature through the night. Medieval architecture was not exactly known for its insulation. Stone walls, thatched roofs, and windows made of animal horn or oiled parchment did little to keep out the cold. Central heating was a fantasy, unless you counted the family dog, who doubled as both radiator and security system. So people turned to the humble nightcap, which came in all shapes and sizes. The classic version was long and pointed, perfect for impersonating a wizard with questionable hygiene, made from wool, linen, or whatever scraps you could spare. Always careful not to upset the goats. These hats were practical for men. For women, the cap often doubled as a coif or head wrap, maintaining modesty and hiding hair that might not have seen soap since last Lent. And beyond warmth, the nightcap carried real social significance. In some regions, married women were expected to keep their heads covered at all hours, even while asleep. The fancier the cap, the higher your social standing. So nothing said success quite like a hat that looked like a small flag fluttering atop your head. In more urban areas, the nightcap even became a symbol of being off-duty. If someone answered the door in a nightcap, it was the medieval equivalent of saying, "I'm not dressed for visitors, and no, I don't want to discuss your turnip prices." Of course, nightcaps were usually paired with a nightshirt, a long, loose tunic that looked a lot like what Scrooge wears, minus the existential haunting. Sleepwear was rarely stylish, often itchy, and occasionally a fire hazard. Today, the prospect of sleeping next to a stranger is mostly limited to red-eye flights, ill-fated camping trips, or the occasional Airbnb horror story. In medieval Europe, though, bed sharing with strangers was completely normal and rarely optional. Imagine you're a travelling merchant, a pilgrim, or just someone whose donkey staged a rebellion halfway to Norwich. You finally stumble into an inn, expecting a cosy room. What you get, however, is a spot in an already occupied bed. Inns in medieval times were more like human filing cabinets than hotels. Privacy was a myth. If there was space in a bed, you were sharing it. And if you were lucky, your bunkmate didn't snore or talk in their sleep about suspicious boils. This wasn't seen as rude. It was just the most efficient way to maximize resources. Beds often hosted 2, 3, even 4 travelers, depending on everyone's tolerance for elbows. In bigger cities, you might end up in a giant hall packed with beds, each one filled with snoring, snuffling strangers. Elbow space was precious. Snoring contests, if judged, would have been legendary. Sometimes inns tried to match guests by profession, putting blacksmiths with other blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, and thieves with other thieves, or at least that's what they claimed. Most of the time it was simply first come, first sprawled. For the modern germaphobe, this all sounds like a nightmare, but compared to sleeping outside with wolves, rain, and the occasional peasant insurrection, it was a major upgrade. Of course, theft was always a risk. Savvy travellers tied their purses to their belts or slept on top of their belongings, turning luggage into both pillow and alarm system. If you woke up and your bag had moved, it usually meant you were about to have a very bad morning. The wealthy, as always, travelled in their own orbit. Nobles brought entourages, camped in relative luxury, or demanded a private room if the innkeeper valued their roof, and possibly their teeth. If you're ever tempted to complain about a questionable hostel mattress or a noisy hotel neighbour, just remember, at least you aren't sharing your bed with a merchant, a goat, and a blacksmith who snores in Middle English. In medieval Europe, sleep was less of a private retreat and more of a communal endurance sport. But the peculiar rituals of the medieval night didn't end at the bed's edge. There were spiritual, social, and even animal-driven routines that shaped how people wound down for the night. In the medieval world, going to bed wasn't just about pulling up a blanket and drifting off. Bedtime in medieval Europe was an exercise in spiritual caution, a nightly ritual where the shadow of death loomed uncomfortably close. You didn't just tuck yourself in and hope for the best. Instead, every night became a miniature judgment day, with bedtime prayers standing in for a last will and testament. Forget soothing playlists or herbal teas. Nights were spent whispering pleas for mercy, just in case your soul got called up for inspection before the rooster crowed. The logic was simple and a shade grim. Medieval people lived with the constant awareness that any night could be their last, whether thanks to fever, a house fire, a rogue demon, or simply the dangerous business of turning 30 before antibiotics. So you'd better hedge your bets with a few prayers, not for peaceful dreams, but to avoid showing up at the pearly gates in spiritual disarray. There was an almost contractual feel to the process. The classic, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take," sounds sweet on paper, but it's really a toddler's version of signing your soul's release forms. Adults, of course, had a more elaborate system. There was a prayer for every possible hazard, a guilty conscience, suspicious creaks in the rafters, or the faintest whiff of plague in the air. If you were feeling especially vulnerable, you'd call on a saint known for keeping watch over sleepers, sort of like a supernatural bouncer enforcing the guest list at an exclusive nightclub. At monasteries and among the ultra-devout, bedtime meant the closing ritual called compline, the final prayer service of the day. After compline, you'd enter a period of strict silence, though honestly most folks were too hungry, cold and nervous about night terrors to make much conversation anyway. For children, bedtime prayers were both spiritual insurance and a handy distraction from the more pressing question, why is the goat in my spot again? Parents reassured their offspring that angels were keeping vigil, which sounds lovely until you realize this was less about comfort and more about the celestial version of home surveillance. In essence, medieval bedtime prayer wasn't about achieving inner peace. It was more like a last-ditch attempt at disaster control. In essence, medieval bedtime prayer wasn't about achieving inner peace. It was more like a last-ditch attempt at disaster control. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of running virus scans before shutting down your computer for the night. You never really knew if it worked, but you hoped it would keep the worst at bay. Now, in our modern world, dreams are usually blamed on anxiety, cheese, or the brain's late-night paperwork. But in the Middle Ages, dreams were treated with the seriousness of prophecies. They weren't just nighttime entertainment. Dreams could be warnings, messages, temptations, or even evidence in your ongoing case for sainthood. A dream wasn't just a dream. It could be a telegram from God, a post-it from your guardian angel, a prank from the devil, or perhaps the lingering effect of that relic you kissed after Sunday Mass. The stakes were high. Some dreams revealed divine truths. Others were traps laid by evil forces. Either way, the message to medieval dreamers was clear. Pay attention, record everything, and maybe skip dinner for the next 3 days, just to be safe. Monks, theologians, and freelance visionaries spent hours trying to decode their dreams, writing entire books about what it meant if you saw fire, water, or a goat-headed man balancing carp. That last one? Definitely time to call a priest, and perhaps reconsider your sleeping arrangements. The underlying belief was that the soul remained active during sleep, so whatever happened in your dreams could reveal your hidden virtues or exposed sins. Did you dream about stealing bread? That might be your subconscious trying to confess your real-world gluttony, or just your stomach complaining. Either way, better confess to be on the safe side. Monks and nuns kept dream diaries and offered up their nighttime visions for spiritual review. Occasionally, someone's dream was hailed as a vision worthy of reverence. More often, they were told to lay off the midnight onions. Dreams weren't just spiritual puzzles either. They were the medieval version of Netflix. Epic tales featured knights meeting angels, devils, or animals with a talent for moralizing poetry. The only catch, there was a lot more allegory and a lot less chance of a happy ending. The church, ever suspicious, didn't trust all dreams. Some were considered divine, but others were thought to be the work of demons, a kind of nightly phishing scam designed to corrupt the innocent. If your dreams took an unsavory turn, you might be under spiritual attack. Or, more likely, you just inhaled a bit too much fireplace smoke. And while modern pet owners might let the dog hog the pillow, in medieval Europe, sharing a bed with animals was less a lifestyle choice and more a matter of not freezing to death. Medieval cottages weren't built for comfort. Stone walls, no insulation, and drafts so persistent you might as well have given them names. The only central heating system was the family pig. For peasants, it was standard to share your sleeping quarters with your livestock, and sometimes, if you were particularly blessed, share your actual straw pile with a chicken, a goat, or a dog. Chickens strutted around near the hearth, dogs curled up at your feet, pigs snored softly in the corner, and if you survived until morning without being bitten, you called that a win. Affection for animals was a bonus, but the real reason for this domestic menagerie was warmth. Animals radiated heat. A large dog could keep your toes functional, and a cow parked by the wall could nudge the temperature up just enough to make January survivable. In the lower classes, there was usually a single room for everything: cooking, eating, sleeping, and sometimes falling ill, all in one drafty box. The entire household, humans and livestock, made do with whatever space was available. Youngsters might be nestled between a parent and a goat, and a chicken could double as a very unreliable alarm clock. Hygiene? Best not to think about it too closely. The upper classes, meanwhile, could afford a bit more separation. Nobles generally avoided sleeping with livestock, though lapdogs were common, if only as status symbols and mobile flea dispensers. Extra wealthy lords sometimes gave their favourite dogs their own sleeping quarters, because nothing says power like a spaniel with a private suite. Of course, there were drawbacks to animal cohabitation. Animals are not known for their respective boundaries or volume control. A hoof to the face at 3 a.m. was just a regular part of the medieval bedtime adventure. If you've ever complained about sharing a hostel bunk, let me introduce you to the medieval monastic dormitory, a place where comfort went to die, usually in silence. Monasteries were not big on personal space, softness, or anything resembling fun. A typical dormitory housed dozens of monks in a single echoing room, lined up in austere rows like saints in training sardines. Beds were wooden planks, occasionally softened by straw if the abbot was feeling generous, or the calendar suggested a feast day. You slept in your full monastic outfit, not out of modesty, but because changing at 2 a.m. for prayers was a special kind of agony. The tunic and belt doubled as both spiritual armour and a weak defence against the cold. If you felt a chill, you layered up and hoped for the best. If you were too warm, well, that was not a recognised problem. There were no pillows, no curtains, and certainly no talking. Silence was enforced with the zeal of a librarian on a warpath. If you so much as groaned too loudly when rolling over, you could find yourself volunteering for the least glamorous monastery chores. Snoring, however, was a theological grey area. You couldn't really control it, but if you disrupted your neighbour's sleep, someone might have a word with you, or arrange a little extra penance. Lighting was minimal, with maybe a single candle guttering in the corner. You didn't need to see anything. Your only job was to lie still and avoid any hint of sin. The austerity was the point. For monks, these hard beds were a kind of boot camp for the afterlife, training the soul by denying the flesh. Sleep wasn't a pleasure, but a scheduled necessity, monitored as strictly as prayer or fasting. Some monks even slept sitting up, just to avoid any whiff of indulgence or blood circulation. Compared to this, peasants in straw piles surrounded by snoring pigs might have seemed positively spoiled. At least the pig didn't judge. And with that, we shift from the spiritual and animal sides of medieval sleep to something even more shocking to the modern eye: the peculiar rituals and superstitions that governed who slept where, how, and why. Let's dive into a medieval nighttime ritual that would send most modern sleepers straight back under the covers. Picture this. You're roused at 2 a.m, not because you need to check your phone or answer nature's call, but because it's time to shuffle groggily into a stone-cold chapel for prayer. Yes, in every monastery I've ever visited, uninvited, I might add, this was business as usual. The monastic day wasn't really a day at all. It was a series of interruptions, mapped out according to the canonical hours, and the first of those matins struck when the world outside was still deep in shadow, and the only things awake were the rats, and occasionally a very confused rooster. The bell would clang, always rung by the monk who lost that evening's lottery, and suddenly an entire dormitory of half-asleep, fully clothed souls would drag themselves from their straw mattresses. Medieval monks didn't believe in pyjamas or even the dignity of a nightshirt. Their approach to layering was purely spiritual. You wore your habit to bed, and you wore it to prayer. I tried suggesting a nice flannel set once, but apparently nothing ruins piety like comfort. Inside the chapel, the mood was equal parts holy and haunted. Flickering candlelight barely pushed back the darkness, and every whispered footstep echoed beneath the vaulted stone. There, monks would stand in rows, chanting psalms with the sort of determination you only see in people desperately trying to stay awake. And believe me, falling asleep mid-prayer was a recurring occupational hazard. There are actual records of monks being disciplined for dozing off, usually with the sort of creative punishments only a medieval abbot could dream up. Brother, you nodded off during matins? Fantastic. You get to lead the next one. Twice. Enjoy. Sometimes the penalty was more prayer. Sometimes manual labour at dawn. In either case, the message was clear. God was watching, and so was Brother Geoffrey, who definitely kept score. Matins could drag on for an hour, sometimes two, depending on the enthusiasm of the order and the length of the psalms. Now imagine trying to keep your mind on the eternal while your stomach grumbles about last night's meal, usually a single bowl of lentils and a stern lecture about humility, and your body is busy plotting its revenge. After the service, if you were lucky, you got to crawl back into your shared bed for what they called second sleep. If you belonged to a stricter order, congratulations, you got to go thresh wheat or copy manuscripts while your eyelids staged a coup. So why did they do it? The idea was, by giving up comfort and surrendering the quietest part of the night, you were offering something valuable to God, something unspoiled by daylight, warmth, or frankly, RAM cycles. It was devotion by way of sleep deprivation. Once you got past the numb toes, the endless smoke, and the off-key chanting of Brother Thomas, who, if you ask me, could clear out a chapel faster than a plague, you were left with a sense of shared purpose, or at the very least, shared exhaustion. Now let's talk about sleeping arrangements, which make modern hotel room assignments look positively luxurious. Today, sleeping alone is seen as a privilege, a mark of independence, tranquility, or simply a refusal to share the blanket. In the medieval world, though, solitary sleep was suspicious, impractical, and frankly a little dangerous. The first issue was warmth. Medieval beds were about as insulating as a stone bench in February. Stone walls and open hearths were terrible at trapping heat, so everyone from children to parents to visiting neighbours' kids piled into bed together. It was less a family bonding moment and more a desperate attempt to avoid hypothermia. But there was more to it than just warmth. Many people believed nighttime was prime time for the devil and his associates. If you slept alone, you risked leaving your soul exposed to temptation, or worse, demonic possession. Sleeping in numbers provided a kind of spiritual shield. If something supernatural happened, at least there'd be a witness or a scapegoat. Children, especially, were kept far from solitary sleep, not just because of the cold, but because the world at night was crawling with ghosts, fairies, and wandering spirits. Bedtime stories back then weren't designed to comfort. They were cautionary tales with endings that usually featured someone vanishing into thin air, not drifting peacefully to sleep. Even married couples rarely enjoyed a night to themselves. Their beds were routinely invaded by children, servants, and the occasional random guest who needed a place to crash. Privacy was a foreign concept, something you might have heard about from a friend of a friend who had a cousin who once visited Italy. In fact, the image of a couple alone in a giant bed would have either seemed wildly extravagant or deeply suspicious, possibly both. In monastic life, communal sleeping was still the rule. If you were told to sleep alone, it usually meant you'd done something wrong. Solitary sleep wasn't a reward, it was a punishment, because apparently nothing invites sin quite like a little peace and quiet. So next time you find yourself tucked up in a bed that's all your own, with your own pillow and not a goat in sight, savour the solitude. In medieval times, you'd be sharing your mattress with 2 children, a sheepdog, and probably a cousin you don't even like, all snoring in concert. And if you ever wondered why medieval folks believed in so many night terrors, just imagine the symphony of snores, creaking beds, and the drafty chill, and remember, some things are scarier than ghosts. And speaking of discomfort, let's get to the truly medieval art of trying to sleep under circumstances that would send most of us scrambling for a hotel refund. If you've ever accidentally fallen asleep sitting up in a lecture, a carriage, or a dentist's waiting room, you probably woke up with a crick in your neck and a deep sense of regret. If you've ever accidentally fallen asleep sitting up in a lecture, a carriage, or a dentist's waiting room, you probably woke up with a crick in your neck and a deep sense of regret. But if you think waking up with a stiff neck after dozing off in a boring lecture is bad, you've only scratched the surface of what medieval folks went through, by choice. Back then, sleeping upright wasn't just for the sleep-deprived or the tragically bored. It was practically a status symbol, a nightly ritual for the wealthy and the devout. Now, you might be thinking, why would anyone willingly transform their bed into a glorified wooden recliner? The answer is a delightful mix of questionable science and even more questionable theology. Medieval physicians, who had a knack for turning the common cold into a metaphysical crisis, believed that lying flat on your back was an invitation for all your bodily humours to stage a mutinous uprising. Digestion, they declared, would fail, lungs would fill up, and worst of all, your brain might become congested. A fate that sounds suspiciously like a bad hangover. Upright sleeping, they claimed, would keep your soul firmly tethered and your bodily fluids flowing in all the right directions. But medicine wasn't the only concern. There was also the matter of spiritual optics. Lying flat, it was whispered, was dangerously similar to the pose struck by the dearly departed. It was as if God, peering down from on high, might mistake your after-dinner nap for an early check-in at the pearly gates. No one wanted to risk being mistaken for a corpse in the middle of the night, especially if the local priest happened to be both a spiritual advisor and an amateur coroner. So beds were outfitted with a minor architecture of bolsters, pillows, and the medieval equivalent of a recliner's headboard. Nobles lounged in slanted beds, propped up regally like half-baked soufflés, digesting their mutton pies and fending off both indigestion and demon-related interruptions. Monks, always eager to outdo everyone in the misery department, sometimes slept sitting up on hard benches, hoods pulled over their heads, backs pressed against icy stone, all to stave off the sin of dreaming. Comfort was not the point. Virtue was. That and a touch of masochism. Of course, if you're picturing peaceful slumber with flickering candlelight and soft linen, allow me to shatter that illusion. The real terrors of medieval sleep didn't wear horns or carry pitchforks. They were much smaller, with far more legs. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were the original sleep disruptors. Forget haunted castles. The medieval bedroom was terrorized nightly by an army of pests. Hygiene, as a concept, was about as advanced as a soup recipe, with only 2 ingredients, mud and wishful thinking. Baths were rare, laundry an extravagance, and soap something you might find described in a bestiary. Mattresses stuffed with straw became luxury hotels for every biting creature within a day's ride. Sharing beds was common, and not just with other humans. Sometimes you'd wake to find a chicken or 2 nestled beside you, plotting a midnight escape, or a new form of pillow-based rebellion. Fleas and lice saw no distinction between peasant and noble. For the working poor, they were a daily nuisance. For the rich, they were an embarrassing equalizer. In fact, some aristocrats employed nitpickers, actual servants whose job was to comb through hair and clothing, plucking out lice with the dedication of a jeweler inspecting diamonds. Somewhere there's a medieval resume that proudly lists Master of the Royal Scalp as a career highlight. Bedbugs, meanwhile, preferred the stealth approach. They lurked inside wood frames, mattress seams, and even the cracks between stones, only emerging when the lights went out to dine like pint-sized vampires. Nightcaps and layers of clothing weren't just about warmth or modesty. They were the medieval version of pest control, sleepwear as armour, a desperate attempt to keep the wildlife off your skin. People tried everything to ward off these invaders. Some burned herbs like wormwood or tansy, filling bedrooms with the scent of a particularly judgmental salad. Others packed their beds with garlic, onions, or even ashes, which did almost nothing for the bugs, but did wonders for deterring any would-be romantic advances. The sleep environment was a battlefield, and everyone was losing. Fleas even became a symbol of sin, their bites a daily reminder that humanity had fallen, and the only thing more persistent than original sin was the itch on your shin. Poems were penned about fleas, some moralizing, some bizarrely flirtatious. Nothing says medieval romance like "let us be joined" as the flea unites our blood. Modern sleep might be interrupted by a neighbour's loud playlist or the distant hum of traffic, but in medieval times it was the sensation of something crawling beneath your nightgown. That wasn't anxiety, that was very likely a bedbug. Restless nights were routine, but if you've ever tried to sleep in a metal suit, you haven't truly experienced medieval discomfort. During periods of war, knights and soldiers often chose caution over comfort, drifting off in partial armour. The logic was simple. If you're going to be woken by an enemy charge, You'd rather not be fumbling with your chainmail while half asleep. Sleeping in armor wasn't the norm, thankfully for chiropractors everywhere, but it wasn't rare either. If a castle was under siege, a man-at-arms might only remove his helmet and gloves, snuggling up with his breastplate and sword like the world's most aggressive teddy bear. Shields doubled as pillows, and axes lay within arm's reach. In case of a midnight attack, you didn't want to be caught in your undergarments. Priorities after all. Armor makes for a terrible mattress. Iron is unforgiving, chainmail pinches, and the ambient temperature of a stone castle at night is somewhere between root cellar and meat locker. Add in the cacophony of snoring comrades, the occasional rat, and the soundtrack of distant thunder, and you'd almost prefer the airport terminal experience. Even outside the battlefield, travellers and guards sometimes opted for quilted gambesons, thick padded jackets that offered just enough protection to make you sweat, but not enough to prevent you from being uncomfortable. Rolling over in armour was an exercise in physics and noise. It's said that a single restless night could sound like the world's unhappiest wind chime, waking everyone else and triggering a brief existential crisis about whether the apocalypse had arrived early. Of course, you might think that the only real threat after dark was from pests or marauders, but the medieval mind had a special place for the mysteries of sleep itself. Sleepwalking, or noctambulation for those who enjoyed impressing their friends with Latin, was viewed with suspicion and unease. In a world where the line between the natural and supernatural was as thin as a threadbare blanket, someone wandering around at midnight was not merely sleep-deprived. They were possibly possessed, bewitched, or carrying out secret business for the devil. The sight of a man in a long nightshirt, eyes open but vacant, muttering nonsense while stepping over a goose, was enough to send the entire household scrambling for holy water. Sleepwalkers were often treated as potential harbingers of doom. Some believed they were afflicted by bad humours, particularly the infamous black bile, which medieval doctors blamed for everything from melancholy to spontaneous combustion of the imagination. Others suspected that the soul slipped from the body during sleep and, untethered, left the flesh to wander aimlessly like a mule with nowhere to go. Remedies ranged from the herbal to the downright hazardous. Prayers murmured over beds, iron charms hung above the headboard, or, for the especially unlucky, a leg tied to the nearest heavy object. It sounds extreme, but when your home is filled with open flames, sharp implements, and livestock with questionable boundaries, extreme measures start to look pretty reasonable. Tales circulated of sleepwalkers climbing onto rooftops or wandering into churches in the dead of night. These stories were probably exaggerated, but the fear was real enough to inspire barred windows and lively debates about whether someone could accidentally sin in their sleep. Most sleepwalkers only managed a few aimless laps around the room, or muttered to themselves about imaginary doors, but if one did stumble into a church, the local priest had an excellent excuse to break out the ceremonial incense and schedule an emergency exorcism, just in case the Archangel Michael was looking for a midnight project. Night in the Middle Ages was rarely silent. Church bells marked every sacred and not-so-sacred interval, ringing out at sunrise, meal times, and the dreaded hour of matins, when monks were expected to rise for prayer somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning. If you lived near a monastery, your dreams would be punctuated by the tolling of bells until your mind simply accepted that sleep and sanctity were meant to be slightly incompatible. Bells became the soundtrack of medieval insomnia, the white noise machine of the pious. And then there were the storms. Thunder and lightning were not just meteorological inconveniences, they were epic events. With no double-glazed windows or weather alerts, every storm felt like the possible end of days. Roofs leaked, shutters rattled, and chimneys moaned like banshees on a bad night. Still, people slept, or at least they tried, because life didn't pause for a little thing like existential dread. The next day's work awaited, whether it was ploughing fields, mending roofs, or running from a Viking raid. Even apocalyptic events rarely cancelled bedtime. The 14th century brought famine, war, and the Black Death, but people still curled up on their straw pallets, hoping to wake up with more than just a story to tell. Seeing the death cart roll by at dawn was a grim way to start the day, but it was also a reminder that life and sleep had to go on. If you didn't wake up, some said it was a mercy. Others just mumbled a prayer and tried their luck again the next night. It's almost comical, in a dark way, how adaptable the human body can be. People slept through earthquakes, barn fires, and the occasional angry mob. Chronic sleep deprivation was a fact of life, but if you spent your days slogging through mud, dodging taxes, and worrying about both spiritual and literal damnation, you learnt to sleep wherever and whenever you could. Rest wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity, rough edges and all. Some even used sleep as a form of escape. When the world felt especially bleak, when illness swept through the village, or rumours of doomsday filled the air, curling up under a battered cloak and giving in to exhaustion was a survival strategy. In a way, there's a strange wisdom to that. If you can't control the pestilence, the storms, the snoring night, or the existential uncertainty, you might as well get some rest, at least until the next bell rings or the next flea bites. And so medieval nights were never quite peaceful, but they were a testament to human resilience. Against all odds, people found ways to sleep through discomfort, danger, and even outright absurdity. If you ever have trouble falling asleep in your carefully curated bug-free bedroom, just remember, somewhere in the afterlife, a medieval peasant is laughing at you from his straw mattress, lice comb in hand, wondering what all the fuss is about. Now, if you're feeling itchy just hearing about it, spare a thought for those who couldn't escape the darkness or the discomfort, because sometimes the real danger wasn't in the bed, it was in the minds of the people outside your door. Which brings us to a very different kind of nighttime terror. In the winter of 1692, the village of Salem, Massachusetts, was cloaked in more than just snow. That winter in Salem wasn't just cold, it was brittle with tension, suspicion, and a creeping unease that seemed to settle in every shadow. The snow piled up around the crooked houses, but inside, the fear was thicker than any frost. Salem's Puritan villagers were a tightly wound bunch, always on the lookout for signs of evil, convinced they were building a pure city in the wilderness while being stalked by Satan himself. Life was already a daily struggle. The village had only recently split from Salem town, fracturing over politics and piety, and the wounds were still fresh. Failed crops and smallpox outbreaks had battered the community, while the scars from wars with native tribes ran deep. Neighbours eyed each other with mistrust, inheritance feuds simmered, and anyone with a whiff of difference about them was eyed as a potential threat. Layer that on top of the kind of winter that makes you question every life decision, and you had a recipe for disaster. That disaster began quietly enough, in the parsonage of Reverend Samuel Parris. His young daughter Betty and niece Abigail Williams started behaving in ways that made the family Bible tremble on its stand. The girls screamed at nothing, hurled objects across the room, twisted into strange shapes, and sometimes fell into eerie, silent trances, their eyes wide as if seeing something no one else could. Neighbours began to murmur, voices lowered over fence posts. Were these children cursed, afflicted, or worse, targeted by witchcraft? When the family doctor, William Griggs, was summoned, he examined Betty and Abigail with all the cutting-edge medical knowledge available in 1692. After failing to find any cause for their fits, no fever, no rash, not even a suspicious rash, he made the diagnosis that would ignite the powder keg. Witchcraft, he whispered. Just like that, every anxiety in Salem caught fire. If even the minister's own household could be targeted, then nowhere was safe. The devil wasn't just prowling the woods, he was already inside the walls. Betty and Abigail, encouraged by the adults and fueled by the intense attention, soon began to name names. At first, their accusations targeted the usual suspects, the village's outsiders. It's almost as if Salem had a checklist for who looked like a good candidate for witchcraft. Sarah Good, for instance, was a homeless woman who wandered door to door, muttering to herself when the good townsfolk refused her charity. People were convinced her mumblings were curses, and her habit of snapping at children certainly didn't help. She smoked a pipe, a scandal in itself, and wore her poverty like a warning sign. Then there was Sarah Osborne. She hadn't darkened the church door in over a year, and she had the audacity to marry her indentured servant after her first husband died. To the Puritans, this was practically a written invitation for the devil to move in. Osborne's outsider status made her an easy mark. But it was Tituba, the enslaved woman from Barbados in the Paris household, who truly set the storm in motion. Her accent, her stories of magic and spirits, and her very presence unnerved the villagers. Under pressure, perhaps even more than pressure, as the threat of violence hung in the air, Tituba confessed to witchcraft, But her confession didn't close the case. It blew it wide open. She spun tales of a tall man in black, a sinister figure offering her a book to sign. She spoke of yellow birds, red cats, and spectral dogs, conjuring vivid images that sent a chill through every listener. Most damning of all, she insisted that there were many witches in Salem, not just herself. That claim was all the court needed. Tituba's confession became a Pandora's box, and everyone in Salem was suddenly a potential suspect. The accusations multiplied at a dizzying pace. Old grudges found new fuel, as neighbours who'd feuded over property lines or livestock now saw their rivals named as witches. If a cow died or a child cried during a prayer, the explanation was simple: witchcraft. The logic of the village twisted in on itself. To defend an accused person was to risk being accused yourself, so most people kept their heads down and mouths shut. Silence became the only safety. The web grew, sticky and invisible, until almost everyone felt its pull. What started as eerie afflictions in the parsonage became a full-blown epidemic of fear. More girls joined the ranks of the afflicted: Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and their performances grew more dramatic with every accusation. In court, they convulsed, shrieked, and claimed to see spectral figures tormenting them. It was public, it was theatrical, and perhaps most frightening of all, the adults believed every word. As the panic swelled, the colonial government decided it was time to step in, or at least appear to. Governor William Phips, new to the job and keen to restore some semblance of order, created a special tribunal. They called it the Court of Oya and Termina, which sounds fancy until you realize it just meant to hear and determine. In reality, it was less a court of law and more a panic-driven assembly line for accusations and convictions. This was not your standard courtroom drama. The court accepted something called spectral evidence. Basically, if someone said they saw your ghostly shape choking them in a dream, that was enough to ruin your life. You couldn't cross-examine a nightmare, and you certainly couldn't defend yourself against invisible crimes. The accused stood alone. No lawyers, no defense, just the full weight of the community's fear pressing down on their shoulders. Children became star witnesses. The afflicted girls, by now seasoned veterans of courtroom melodrama, would fall into fits the moment an accused witch appeared. One of them, Mary Walcott, had a particularly theatrical touch. If a prisoner so much as glanced her way, she screamed. If they looked away, she screamed louder. The judges, including Samuel Sewall and Chief Justice William Stoughton, treated every gasp and cry as gospel truth. The more the girls writhed, the more convinced the justices became. If you confessed, you might save your life, but only by naming others. If you stayed silent or denied the charges, the afflicted girls redoubled their agony, and you were doomed. The system rewarded lies and punished honesty. The trials became a kind of grim entertainment. Townsfolk flocked from miles around to watch, and the accused were paraded through the streets in shackles, bewildered and often broken. Yet, not everyone was fooled. Behind closed doors, some whispered that the girls were faking. Others wondered aloud why the same types of people kept getting named: those with property, the outspoken, the oddballs. But few dared question the court in public. To do so was to risk being accused yourself, or worse, to defy what the judges claimed was God's will. In Salem, reason had been shoved out the door, and fear ruled in its place. Then, on June 10th, 1692, the gallows claimed its first victim, Bridget Bishop. She was no stranger to scandal, known for her bright red gowns and her tavern, which made her the talk of the town long before the word witch was ever uttered. During her trial, neighbours testified to all manner of supernatural visits: babies dying after she passed by, enchanted dolls hidden in her house, her spirit pinching them in their sleep. Bridget denied it all, but her fate was sealed. On a barren hill just outside Salem, she was hanged, no prayers or mercy extended. The crowd watched in silence as the rope tightened, and the machinery of death began to grind. The executions came swiftly after that. On July 19th, 5 more women were hanged: Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Some, like Rebecca Nurse, were pillars of the church, beloved and trusted for decades. Her case shocked the community. Even the jury found her not guilty at first, but under relentless pressure from the court and the afflicted girls, the verdict was reversed. Rebecca's last words floated across the crowd. "I am as innocent as the child unborn. It made no difference." The noose was impartial. August brought more hangings. Then on September 22nd, 8 people were executed in one awful morning, among them Martha Corey, who had dared to question the trials, and her stubborn husband Giles Corey. Giles, refusing to enter a plea, faced an ancient punishment: stones piled on his chest, one after another, for 3 agonizing days. According to legend, his last words were a defiant, "More weight." By the end, 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death, and at least 5 more died in the squalor of Salem's jails, awaiting a trial that never came. Over 200 names were swept into the dragnet of suspicion. Many confessed to impossible crimes just to save themselves, while others clung to their innocence and paid with their lives. The gallows cast a long, cold shadow over Salem, not just on the hill where the executions took place, but across every home and hearth. Fear had replaced justice, and the law had become a tool for settling scores, not seeking the truth. It was a community so desperate for certainty that it would rather hang a neighbour than face its own anxieties. And yet, even as the noose tightened and the stones pressed down, whispers of doubt began to snake through the population. Some questioned the wisdom of letting children and dreams decide matters of life and death. Others wondered how many more would fall before someone finally said, "Enough." As the hysteria threatened to consume what little remained of Salem's peace, the village stood on the brink. The fever would not last forever, but the scars it left would run deep, shaping the memory of Salem for centuries to come. But while the executions seized everyone's attention, the story wasn't over. Hundreds of others languished in cramped, stinking jails, waiting for either a verdict or a miracle. In the next chapter, we turn to the collapse of the trials and the reckoning that followed, a community slowly waking from a nightmare of its own making. Salem's own jail, never built for a crisis of this scale, overflowed so quickly that prisoners were carted off to neighbouring towns, Ipswich, Boston and beyond. There they sat, shackled to the rough stone walls, shivering through New England nights, ignored by all but the lice and the rats. If you're picturing a colonial version of a cosy holding cell, think again. Imagine your worst hotel stay. Now remove the beds, the windows and all hope, and you're getting close. Most of these prisoners were not witches, nor rebels, nor even particularly odd. They were the familiar faces of the village, the woman who'd brought you soup when you were sick, the neighbour who lent you a cow, the schoolmaster, the baker, the mother of 7. Their real offence was often as simple as arguing with the wrong person or owning a patch of land someone else fancied. In the world of 1692 Salem, losing your temper over a stray pig could get you hanged. If your neighbour's firewood mysteriously split itself, perhaps your refusal to help had hexed the axe. Justice, it seems, is easily warped when fear takes the bench. Mary East's story is a perfect example. She was the sister of Rebecca Nurse, who'd already been sent to the gallows. Mary was a pillar of the community, a devout mother, and about as threatening as a loaf of plain bread. The court released her at first, but when the afflicted girls slipped into fresh fits, Mary was rearrested. This second arrest was fatal. In her final petition, Mary pleaded with the judges, not for herself but for the madness to end. She begged them to stop the killing, to spare more innocent lives. Her words went unheeded. Mary was hanged soon afterwards, leaving behind her children and a warning that unfortunately would go ignored. It wasn't just adults who fell victim. Dorothy Good, just 4 years old, was swept up in the madness after her mother Sarah Good was accused. Interrogators pressed Dorothy until, terrified and barely able to form a sentence, she confessed to witchcraft. Her babbling, the fearful ramblings of a child, became evidence of guilt. Dorothy was sentenced to 8 months in chains. 8 months that shattered her mind. She emerged from prison a different child, one who never truly recovered. Even pregnancy offered no protection. Elizabeth Proctor, wife of John Proctor, who would eventually hang, was condemned to die, but her execution was postponed until after childbirth. That small mercy likely saved her. She gave birth in her cell and was released after the trial's collapse, a rare glimmer of survival in a season of death. Accusations spread like wildfire. Some, desperate to avoid the noose, confessed and pointed fingers at friends and neighbours. False confessions fueled new arrests. Entire families vanished into the system. Fathers, wives, daughters. No one was beyond suspicion. The jails grew so crowded that food ran short and illnesses ran rampant. Some prisoners died in their cells, nameless casualties of a justice system gone rabid. Meanwhile, every week brought fresh accusations and another round of arrests. At this point, it no longer mattered who you were, only whose name someone was willing to speak in a fevered courtroom. By the time autumn leaves began to fall in 1692, the spell of mass hysteria started to fracture, not because the authorities experienced some sudden moral epiphany, but because chaos threatened to swallow the entire colony. The moment of reckoning crept in quietly at first. Then all at once, the accusations, which had once targeted the fringes of society, now fell on the respected elite. Reverend George Burroughs, a former minister in Salem and a man of education and standing, found himself accused of leading the witches. His true crime was a history of clashing with powerful families. That was enough. Burroughs' execution became the stuff of legend. Standing atop the gallows, he stunned the crowd by reciting the Lord's Prayer perfectly, something witches were supposedly incapable of doing. The crowd, primed for blood, fell silent. Some wept. Others shifted uncomfortably. Even the most hardened witch hunters faltered, but the hangman did not. The rope snapped, and Burroughs was gone. Yet, in that moment, a seed of doubt was sown. Then, the hysteria overreached. Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps himself, was named as a witch. If you ever want to see a politician act quickly, threaten his spouse. Governor Phipps, already reeling from the chaos and a colony teetering on the edge of revolt, finally intervened. In October 1692, he dissolved the Court of Oyer and Termina, abruptly halting all trials and executions. Just like that, the machinery of death ground to a halt. Public opinion shifted with breathtaking speed. Ministers who had once fanned the flames began to douse them. Increase Mather, one of New England's most respected theologians, denounced the use of so-called spectral evidence. He declared it was better that 10 suspected witches escape than for a single innocent person to die, a radical notion in a society that had just spent months believing precisely the opposite. People who once cheered the trials now whispered about their horror. The jails remained full, but the thirst for vengeance had faded. The town was battered, exhausted. Too many upstanding citizens had swung from the gallows. Too many innocent graves had been dug. The villagers began to realize this was not the hand of God. It was madness, and it had left them in ruins. Confessions dried up. Some accusers began to recant. Others simply disappeared. Those who had most loudly demanded blood now kept their heads down. Fear had not vanished, but it had spent itself. Salem wanted order, not more chaos. Officials, eager to save face, clung to any excuse to end the nightmare. And so, bruised, shamed, and stunned by its own reflection, Salem finally began to wake from its fever dream. The storm had passed, but it left devastation in its wake. By late 1692, the legal system that had once fueled the hysteria now staggered under the weight of its own absurdity. With the infamous court dissolved, a new tribunal, the Superior Court of Judicature, assembled in early 1693. These judges, perhaps remembering how close they'd come to accusing the governor's wife, were far less eager to convict. Spectral evidence, the flimsiest of proofs, was thrown out. The wild performances of the afflicted girls now raised eyebrows, not verdicts. The results were immediate. Of the 56 cases brought before the new court, most ended in acquittal. Even those who had previously confessed began to retract their words, admitting they'd lied out of fear or under threat. The magic, if you can call it that, had fled the proceedings. The most high-profile unravelling came with the case of Reverend Samuel Willard, a respected minister who found himself under suspicion. Though never formally charged, the mere fact that a devout and reputable man could be suspected showed just how senseless it had all become. The court, once eager for spectacle, now moved quietly. Prisoners were released in batches, first those with the thinnest cases against them, then even those who had confessed under duress. Outside the jails, the families of the hanged began to demand justice. John Proctor's children petitioned for the return of their father's property. The family of Rebecca Nurse launched a campaign to clear her name. Where once there had been only terror and accusation, now there was shame and outrage. The town's fabric, so carefully woven over generations, was now shredded. Congregations split. Friends became lifelong enemies. The authorities, realizing that their colony had become an international scandal, scrambled to contain the damage. Governor Phipps issued pardons for the remaining prisoners in 1693, but freedom was not free. Many families had to pay the costs of their own imprisonment before release. Imagine stepping out of jail, penniless, traumatized, and handed a bill for surviving. In the end, 19 people had been hanged, 1 crushed to death beneath stones, 5 perished in jail, and more than 200 had been accused. The system didn't simply collapse, it imploded, leaving grief, regret, and disbelief in its place. The trials were over, but the wounds were raw and the healing had not even begun. Salem was a different town now, haunted not by witches, but by its own guilt. What had begun with a few afflicted girls snowballed into a communal disaster. Entire families were torn from each other. Reputations were destroyed. The living were left to pick through the rubble of lost trust and ruined friendships. Neighbors who had once shared pews and prayers could barely meet each other's gaze. Some of the afflicted girls quietly slipped away from Salem. Others faded into the background. Anne Putnam, Jr., one of the most vocal accusers, eventually stood before her church in 1706 and publicly apologized for her role, blaming her delusions on Satan. But for many, words could not mend what had been broken. Even those who had presided over the carnage found their consciences heavy. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the leading figures of the trials, did something almost unheard of. He confessed his guilt. In 1697, he stood up in church, head bowed, while a minister read out his confession and plea for forgiveness. It was a rare spark of accountability in a community desperate to forget. But forgetting was impossible. The families of the condemned demanded reparations. Over the years, petitions poured into the Massachusetts government, pleading for pardons, for lost property, for public recognition that the executed were innocent. The government's response was slow but not absent. In 1711, the colony finally restored the rights and good names of some victims and offered limited financial restitution. Yet even then, some families, like the Coreys and the Proctors, were overlooked. The stain remained. The whispers of witchcraft lingered in New England, like a musty smell that never quite leaves an old mattress. For Salem, the shame became a defining feature. In time, the village changed its name to Danvers, perhaps hoping to distance itself from the infamy. Gallows Hill was never officially marked, as if the townspeople believed that if they didn't carve it in stone, the memory would fade. But the memory persisted, in sermons, in stories, in the silence that now stretched between neighbors. Salem had not been cursed by witches, but by fear, pride, and unchecked authority. That curse lingered long after the executions stopped, woven into the town's very identity. More than 3 centuries have passed since the Salem witch trials, but the echo of those events still rings. Their legacy lives on, not just in history books or the odd haunted house tour, but in the way we think about justice, the dangers of panic, and the fragility of truth. What happened in 1692 wasn't just a weird chapter of mass hysteria. It was a total collapse of logic, compassion, and legal principle in the face of fear. Ordinary people, farmers, midwives, ministers, became executioners, not by malice, but by believing too quickly and questioning too little. The courts, meant to protect the innocent, became tools of destruction. Religion became a weapon. Testimony turned into theatre. And silence, too, became damning. Perhaps the most chilling thing is how quickly it all happened. In just a few months, suspicion became death sentences. Grudges wore the mask of righteousness, and were settled with a noose. It took no demons, no devils, just belief in them. Yet the trials left behind hard-won lessons. In the decades and centuries that followed, Salem became a cautionary tale. When the United States Constitution was drafted nearly a century later, its authors made sure to prohibit the sorts of legal abuses that doomed the accused in Salem. Protections like the right to an attorney, the right to confront your accusers, and the need for actual evidence, These weren't just ideas plucked from thin air, they were forged in the ashes left by Gallows Hill. Today we toss around the phrase witch hunt as shorthand for any persecution or moral panic, usually forgetting the sheer terror those words once meant. Salem wasn't a metaphor. It was a real town where people died for crimes no one could prove, betrayed by the very systems meant to keep them safe. The most enduring warning from Salem is this: fear, if left unchecked, turns into its own form of tyranny. And when that fear is given power, by courts, by churches, by government, it becomes almost impossible to stop. The Salem witch trials are more than a story about a village gone mad. They're a reminder of how easy it is for reason to falter and for justice to disappear. Whenever fear is allowed to rule, the gallows are gone now, the courtrooms are silent. But the warning remains: truth is fragile, justice is never automatic, and history has a nasty habit of repeating itself if we aren't careful. And as I dusted off my tricorn hat and left Salem's haunted lanes behind, I couldn't help but wonder what other odd corners of history were waiting for their own reckoning, or for another time-travelling fixer to bungle things up once again. Speaking of fixers and power struggles, it's time to leave the chill of colonial Massachusetts and duck into the sun-baked streets of ancient Rome, where ambition, intrigue, and a woman named Fulvia were about to shake the Republic to its core. Imagine, if you will, the city of Rome in the early 1st century BCE, a place so full of political intrigue, feuding patricians, and barely contained chaos that it makes modern reality TV look like a church picnic. And in the middle of this chaos there's a girl born into the Fulvian family, a clan with a reputation for throwing elbows in the corridors of power. The Fulvi weren't the oldest patricians on the block, but they'd spent generations muscling their way into Rome's elite. They produced consuls, generals, and a parade of orators who could talk their way out of, or, more often, into trouble. Their family motto, if they had one, would have been something like, "Why follow the rules when you can rewrite them?" Now Fulvia's father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was a man who, let's just say, struggled in the public speaking department. His nickname Bambalio literally meant the stammerer. Picture a senator with all the gravitas of a malfunctioning voice assistant. Well-meaning but liable to get stuck on the same syllable, but Fulvia was nothing like her father. Where he stammered, she commanded. In a family of political survivors, Fulvia stood out as a natural-born strategist. From the moment she could walk, Fulvia was submerged in the cutthroat rituals of Roman politics. Imagine growing up in a house where the dinner conversation wasn't about school or chores, but whether the Senate would survive the month. Senators and generals dropped by, voices echoing through marble halls, plotting their next schemes over olives and wine. She watched as marriages were arranged not for love, but to secure alliances. She saw funerals transform into political rallies and rumours weaponized in the blink of an eye. In other words, Fulvia's childhood was the ancient Roman equivalent of binge-watching every season of Game of Thrones, except the dragons were all metaphorical and the blood feuds were very, very real. Now, Roman society had a clear script for women. Speak softly, look pretty, and don't get involved in politics. Fulvia looked at that script, rolled her eyes, and tossed it into the Tiber. She was wealthy, fiercely intelligent, and minus crucially, she knew how to read a room. While there isn't much in the written record about her early years, the way Fulvia handled herself later in life tells us everything we need to know. This was not a woman designed to fade quietly into the background. She was observant, shrewd, and utterly unafraid to step into the fray, even when the men around her were jostling for power like gladiators in the arena. And what an arena it was! Rome at this time was a city unravelling at the seams. The Republic was less a stable government, and more a powder keg with a lit fuse. You had generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar playing chicken with the fate of the state, populist uprisings and street violence as regular features of city life. The old rules of decorum were collapsing, replaced by the law of the bold and the ruthless. Fulvia didn't just survive this environment, she learned to thrive in it. She figured out that politics was less a gentleman's game and more a battlefield, sharpened by alliances, betrayals, and the occasional riot. Now let's talk about Fulvia's first marriage, the one that would catapult her from promising upstart to a bona fide power player. She married Publius Clodius Pulcher, whose name alone foreshadows a life of drama. Clodius wasn't your standard-issue Roman noble. He was the kind of man who could set a Senate debate on fire just by walking into the room, and sometimes, quite literally, he had a reputation as a populist firebrand, a political arsonist who thrived on chaos and spectacle. To the Roman elite, he was a walking scandal, but to the Roman masses, he was something of a folk hero. For Fulvia, Clodius was less a husband and more a strategic alliance. Their marriage sometime in the stormy 50s BCE fused two ambitious currents of Roman politics. Clodius was infamous for flouting tradition. Once he disguised himself as a woman to sneak into a sacred, women-only festival at Caesar's house. Now, if you're imagining a toga and a bad wig, you're not far off. It created a scandal so big that even the gods seemed to sigh. But did it ruin him? Hardly. His popularity only rose. Clodius understood how to work the crowd, how to turn outrage into support. He gave up his patrician status to become a tribune of the plebs, a move that handed him the power to veto the Senate itself, a sort of ancient Roman version of pulling the emergency brake on government. And Fulvia? She was no wallflower in this partnership. Roman sources hint that she was right there on the front lines, helping Clodius manage his supporters, orchestrating campaigns, and transforming their household into the war room of populist politics. She was visible, active, and unmistakably involved. If Clodius was the spark, Fulvia was the tinder, keeping the flame alive. Together, they were a new kind of Roman power couple, loud, unapologetic, and always one step ahead of the Senate's attempts to rein them in. But in Rome, power always comes with a price. In 52 BCE, Clodius met a violent end on the Appian Way, cut down by the bodyguards of his political rival Titus Annius Milo. His death sent shockwaves through the city, but Fulvia was not about to retreat into the shadows. Instead, she staged a funeral procession that made even seasoned politicians pale. She paraded Clodius's bloodied, mutilated corpse through the heart of Rome, wounds on full display. Picture the scene, crowds gathering, gasping, as Fulvia showed the city exactly what had been done to her husband. The effect was electric. Rome erupted. Mobs rioted. The Senate house went up in flames. Fulvia had turned her personal grief into a public uprising, weaponizing tragedy into political power. This was Fulvia's first major act on the public stage, and it left Rome reeling. With one calculated move, she proved she could manipulate public emotion, turn spectacle into strategy, and wield her husband's legacy like a sword. Suddenly, she wasn't just Clodius's widow. She was a political force in her own right, someone the Senate could neither ignore nor control. But Fulvia had no intention of letting her newfound influence wither in mourning. In Rome, political capital aged faster than cheese left out in the forum sun. She understood this better than anyone. So, not long after the ashes of Clodius's funeral cooled, Fulvia made her next move. She married Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rising star cut from a very different cloth, but just as ambitious. On the surface, Curio might have seemed like an odd choice. He had a reputation for flamboyance and a taste for spectacle, never one to back away from a dramatic gesture. But underneath the showmanship was a sharp political mind. As tribune of the plebs in 50 BCE, Curio wielded immense power at one of Rome's most perilous moments. The Republic was teetering on the edge of civil war, with Caesar and Pompey circling each other like gladiators, each waiting for the other to blink. Fulvia saw in Curio not just a second chance, but a vital bridge to a new power base. This wasn't a rebound romance, it was a tactical alliance. With Clodius gone, Fulvia needed someone who could command the city's populist masses, and crucially, had Caesar's support. Curio was the man for the job. Through Curio, Fulvia didn't just stay in the game, she helped write the next chapter. She kept Clodius's supporters active, rebranding their movement under Curio's banner, and ensuring that the urban crowds remained politically engaged. She was the invisible hand behind the scenes, nudging events in directions that suited her vision. Rome might have expected her to retreat, but Fulvia only doubled down. Of course, Rome's downward spiral didn't slow. Tensions between Caesar and Pompey finally boiled over into outright war. Curio, always eager for the spotlight, threw himself into Caesar's camp, leading a campaign in Africa that would prove disastrous. Fulvia, undeterred, stayed politically engaged. reportedly helping organize support and manage resources for her husband's efforts. But Africa was unkind to Roman ambitions. In 49 BCE, Curio's army was ambushed and destroyed by King Juba of Numidia's forces. Curio was killed, and with him another chapter of Fulvia's life closed in blood and violence. So there she was, widowed yet again by Rome's endless civil strife, two husbands lost to the same churning vortex of ambition and chaos, both men remembered as champions of the people and casualties of the Republic's collapse. But if anyone thought Fulvia would finally step out of the limelight, they had clearly never met Fulvia. Instead, she emerged from the ashes even more formidable, a political widow with a reputation for dangerous resilience, a woman who could turn personal tragedy into public advantage. Her true test, though, was still to come. The alliances she would forge next would not only shake the foundations of Rome, but would challenge the very limits of what a woman could do in a world ruled by men. If you thought Fulvia's first two marriages were dramatic, just wait until she meets Mark Antony. If you ever find yourself at a Roman dinner party, swirling watered wine and dodging questions about your family's political connections, there's a good chance the conversation will eventually turn to Mark Antony. The original life of the party, Antony had a taste for drama, excess, and as it turned out, formidable wives. But no one, not even the rowdiest guest reclining on a dining couch, could have predicted the partnership that would form when Antony married Fulvia around 47 BCE. This was not your standard love story. It was a collision of ambition, survival, and a shared talent for upending everything that Rome thought was proper. By this point, Fulvia had already endured more intrigue than the average Roman senator would stomach in a lifetime. She had buried two husbands, both of whom managed to die violently and inconveniently, and outlasted enough enemies to fill an entire chapter of family feuds. If surviving Rome's political scene was like sleeping in a barn full of lice-ridden goats, Fulvia had learned to do it without flinching. Antony, meanwhile, had a reputation as a lover of luxury, gambling, and the sort of public scandals that made even his most ardent supporters sigh into their togas. But with Fulvia, he had finally met his match, and his better. Their marriage was, at its core, less about candlelit trysts and more about the business of survival and power. Antony needed someone who could manage Rome while he campaigned in the east. He needed a fixer, someone who could keep his interests intact in a city where knives were sharper than the gossip. Fulvia was the answer. She didn't just keep the home fires burning, she stoked them into bonfires. He trusted her with his correspondence, let her open letters meant for his eyes alone, and allowed her to issue orders as if she wore a general's cloak herself. In meetings with Antony's allies, Fulvia's voice carried just as much weight as her husband's, sometimes more, as she had a knack for cutting through the bluster and getting to the real point. Of course, the ancient sources, nearly all hostile, and most written by men who would have preferred Fulvia safely at her loom, could not handle this. They called her domineering, power-hungry, and shrewish, as if the worst sin a woman could commit was to act like a Roman man, and to them, that was exactly her crime. Fulvia didn't play by the rules. She rewrote them, scrawling her name across decrees and appearing in public as the living embodiment of her husband's authority. The chroniclers grumbled, but the coins told a different story. There she was, her name stamped beside Antony's, as if daring the world to pretend she wasn't part of the equation. When Julius Caesar fell to the senators' daggers in 44 BCE, all of Rome reeled. Antony raced to claim his position as Caesar's heir, but it was Fulvia who held the city. While Antony negotiated with generals and pieced together alliances, Fulvia became the cornerstone of his power in Rome. Picture her, sitting in smoky rooms with the city's fixers and strongmen, managing the unruly street gangs, doling out favors, and quietly ensuring that Antony's supporters stayed loyal. In a world where political fortunes could shift faster than a Roman bedbug infestation, Fulvia's steady hand was what kept Antony's cause alive back home. Her influence was no secret. She wielded it openly, arranging marriages, including marrying her own daughter, Claudia, to Antony's rival Octavian, in a move that was as strategic as it was doomed. She sat at the center of Rome's tangled patronage networks, coordinating bribes, deals, and public spectacles. If you needed a favor, you went to Fulvia. If you wanted to stay on Antony's good side, you made sure Fulvia's name was on your guest list. To the Roman elite, especially those nursing grudges or licking their wounds from lost political battles, Fulvia's authority was outrageous. Women were supposed to weep, not wield power. They could mourn their husbands, but they were not supposed to command armies or dictate policy. Yet here was Fulvia, defying every expectation, walking the marble floors of the Senate House, conferring with senators and drafting decrees. For the first time, a Roman woman was not just whispering in the shadows. She was standing in the light, issuing commands and being obeyed. The city buzzed with her presence, and the old guard fumed. But Fulvia knew exactly how precarious her position was. Power in Rome was always a borrowed luxury. Sooner or later, the debtor demanded repayment. The alliance between Antony and Octavian, engineered in part by Fulvia herself, was unraveling, pulled apart by ambition, distrust, and the inevitable tug-of-war over Caesar's legacy. As the cracks widened, Fulvia watched, calculating her next move. She could see the storm gathering on the horizon, and she understood what neither man seemed willing to admit. Rome wasn't big enough for both of them. It was time for action, not diplomacy. Fulvia had spent years playing the role of regent, ruling in Antony's absence, but now she was ready to step onto the battlefield herself, literally. In 41 BCE, she did what no Roman woman had ever dared. She went to war against Octavian, the young upstart who would one day become Augustus. And she didn't do it quietly either. With Antony still occupied in the east, Fulvia partnered with Lucius Antonius, Antony's younger brother and conveniently a sitting consul. Their target was Octavian's grip on Italy, and their cause was cloaked in the defence of Antony's veterans, whose promised land had been snatched away by Octavian's controversial redistribution schemes. But beneath the public slogans and senatorial speeches, it was Fulvia's hand guiding every move. She organised, she strategized, and she rallied support from those who felt betrayed by Octavian's policies. 8 legions, enough to make any enemy sweat, were mustered under Fulvia and Lucius. They seized the city of Perugia, modern-day Perugia, and prepared for a showdown. This was no mere act of support for her absent husband. This was Fulvia's war, and everyone in Rome knew it. The ancient sources, always eager to blame a woman for any breach of the peace, claimed that Fulvia was the true mastermind behind the rebellion, that she pushed Lucius into battle against his better judgment, and that she wielded more authority than any Roman woman before or since. For once they weren't exaggerating. Fulvia wrote letters to generals, coordinated supplies, and kept the troops motivated with promises of land and reward. She was seen addressing soldiers herself, reminding them that their loyalty to Antony would be remembered and paid for. Octavian, though caught off guard by the audacity of a woman leading a rebellion, responded with ruthless efficiency. He besieged Perugia through the bitter winter of 41 to 40 BCE. The city's supplies dwindled. The cold set in. The soldiers, once emboldened by Fulvia's charisma and promises, found themselves trapped, hungry, and abandoned by fate. Inside the city walls, Fulvia faced not only the threat of Octavian's armies, but also the erosion of her own authority. Allies faltered. Supporters wavered. Even Lucius, her supposed partner in this bold gamble, began to lose heart. By early 40 BCE, the inevitable happened. Perugia surrendered. Octavian, ever the politician, spared Lucius, likely as a message to Antony that some lines would not be crossed. But Fulvia was another matter altogether. The woman who had once commanded riots, armies, and the very pulse of Rome was now declared too dangerous to remain on Roman soil. Exile was her reward for daring to act as a man in a world determined to keep women silent and invisible. So Fulvia, the first and only woman in Roman history to wage a civil war, was banished to Sicyon in Greece. She went there hoping for a reunion with Antony, clinging to the hope that their partnership, once so formidable, might still be salvaged. But Antony didn't come. The alliance that had once made them the most powerful couple in Rome had crumbled, undone by distance, betrayal, and the limits of what Rome would allow a woman to do. Fulvia had defied every expectation, challenged every tradition, and forced the men of Rome to reckon with a woman who would not be confined. But Rome, ever jealous of its boundaries, had finally snapped back, and Fulvia, still standing, was left to ponder the cost of her remarkable ambition. As Fulvia stepped off the boat onto the rough shores of Sicyon, she entered a new chapter, not just for herself, but for the story of women, power, and the price of challenging a world that can't imagine you. Her fate now rested in exile, far from the marble halls and stormy politics of Rome. But as we'll see next, exile was not the end of Fulvia. It was the beginning of her legend, and the start of a battle not just for survival, but for legacy. And while Fulvia's struggle was playing out in the ancient world, another seismic movement was brewing centuries later, as America teetered on the edge of transformation, with dreams of justice and freedom about to take to the streets. Banished from Rome, Fulvia landed in Sicyon, a city in Greece that had become a kind of diplomatic purgatory for failed power players. Exiled from the city that once trembled at the sound of her name, Fulvia arrived in Sicyon, a sun-bleached Greek city that had become the last stop for Rome's politically radioactive. Picture it, the dust swirling in the streets, ancient stones warmed by the Mediterranean sun, and Fulvia stepping off the boat with nothing but the heavy memory of the city she'd just lost. Sicyon was no heroic sanctuary. It was more like a waiting room for those Rome wanted out of sight but not necessarily out of mind. A kind of ancient version of being put on hold, except with more olives and fewer phone trees. Fulvia hadn't fought to end up here. She'd gone to war not for personal glory, but to defend her husband Mark Antony's interests, his reputation, and maybe Nina's, just maybe, their vision of what Rome could be. She risked her fortune, her alliances, and her life for a man who, as it turned out, was already halfway across the Mediterranean, cozying up to Cleopatra. While Fulvia was recruiting soldiers and dodging arrows, Antony was raising toasts at banquets, nestled beside Egypt's queen. If Fulvia had been hoping for a hero's reunion, she got the coldest of shoulders. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was political. While Fulvia was enduring siege and exile, Antony was busy building a new alliance, one with a legendary queen who would soon eclipse Fulvia in both myth and memory. Some ancient sources, like the ever-judgmental Plutarch, hint that Antony was furious with Fulvia for launching the Perisine War without his nod of approval. Others suggest he was quietly relieved at her downfall, which cleared the path for a politically convenient marriage to Octavian's sister, something Fulvia would have blocked at every turn. But Fulvia wasn't entirely alone in her exile. Some of Antony's old soldiers, fiercely loyal to her, begged for reconciliation. They remembered the woman who had stood before them in the field, not as an ornament, but as a commander. Yet Fulvia's body finally betrayed her. After years of political combat, siege, flight, and the slow poison of public slander, her health collapsed. She died in Sicyon in 40 BCE, at roughly 43 years old, her end likely hastened by illness, exhaustion, and heartbreak. Or maybe it was just the final, silent victory of a world that refused to make space for her. Her death couldn't have been more convenient for Antony. Here was a clean slate, a diplomatic get-out-of-jail-free card. Almost immediately, Antony met with Octavian to hammer out a fragile peace. The price? He would marry Octavian's sister Octavia, cementing their alliance and giving Rome a reason to pretend the previous bloodshed was all water under the bridge. The triumvirs, those eternally squabbling three, were for a moment united again. But make no mistake, none of it would have been possible if Fulvia had still been alive. She was the single woman willing to stare down the ambitions of Rome's most powerful men. And the cost for that audacity was erasure. Now, if you're thinking Fulvia's fate sounds familiar, you're not wrong. History has a habit of sweeping inconvenient women under the nearest available rug. And Fulvia, she got Cleopatra'd right out of the spotlight. The legends of the Egyptian queen would soon overshadow nearly every Roman woman of the age. But let's be clear, Fulvia was the original. She didn't pull strings from behind a curtain. She yanked them in plain sight, raising armies, dictating strategy, and daring to command in a world where most women were expected to blend in with the furniture. Rome didn't know what to make of her, so it did what it always does. It tried to erase her. But the thing about erasing someone like Fulvia is that the marks never quite disappear. The ashes of her rebellion lingered, and her story was far from ordinary. After her death, the men she'd once outmaneuvered, Antony, Octavian, and even her former allies, set about quietly rewriting her legacy. With Fulvia unable to defend herself, her story was sculpted by her enemies, by survivors of her ambition, and by historians who found her presence deeply unsettling. So what happens to a woman who dares too much? She becomes a scapegoat. Ancient writers, mostly men with a vested interest in keeping Rome's power structure neat and tidy, pointed their inky fingers at Fulvia for everything that had gone wrong. She was cast as the instigator of the Parisine War, the wedge between Antony and Octavian, the emblem of chaos in a republic teetering on the brink. Cassius Dio, Appian, Plutarch, pick your ancient commentator, and you'll find Fulvia painted as jealous, power-hungry, and dangerously ambitious. They accused her of dragging Lucius Antonius into war, of antagonizing Octavian, even of causing Antony's estrangement from his own city. But let's pause for a moment and ask, were these accusations fair? Not even close. Fulvia operated in a political playground where violence and manipulation were the norm, at least if you happen to be a man. She was no more ambitious than Caesar, no more aggressive than Pompey, and far less ruthless than Octavian, who would one day become Augustus and set new records for political backstabbing. Fulvia's real crime was simple. She acted like a Roman man, and Rome, it turned out, had no idea what to do with a woman who played by those rules. She didn't stay cloistered at home, weaving quietly or serving as a living ornament in the background of someone else's story. She was drafting letters to generals, organizing street mobs, and earning the loyalty of soldiers. That made her dangerous, not just to Octavian, but to every man who believed women should be seen but not heard, preferably behind a lattice and wearing something unflattering. Even Mark Antony, the man whose legacy she had defended tooth and nail, found it politically convenient to blame Fulvia for the civil strife. After patching things up with Octavian and marrying his new sister-in-law, Antony treated Fulvia's memory as a diplomatic loose end. No monuments, no public mourning, no grand funeral, just silence. Yet, try as they might, her enemies couldn't erase Fulvia completely. She had done too much, left too many fingerprints on the machinery of power. She raised armies, steered elections, forged alliances, and fought a civil war. She was the first Roman woman to have her name stamped onto coinage, not as a goddess or a poetic metaphor, but as a political agent in her own right. The campaign to destroy her reputation was deliberate, but so was her stubborn presence in the historical record. For every slanderous anecdote, there's evidence of a woman who refused to disappear, a voice that still echoes, minors, if you can tune out the chorus of disapproving men. Fulvia's story, outwardly, ends in silence, but her legacy is anything but quiet. In the centuries after her death, historians and writers wrestled with how to fit her into Rome's grand narrative. Fulvia broke every rule about what a Roman woman was supposed to be. She didn't whisper from the shadows, she took the stage. She didn't manipulate events from the sidelines, she became the event. In a society where women were expected to influence through suggestion and marriage, Fulvia shouted her intentions through policy, through war, and through the sheer force of her personality. She was no consort, she was a commander, and yet for all her achievements, Fulvia's memory was shaped more by her defiance than by her accomplishments. Roman historians, faced with a woman who wouldn't stay in her lane, rewrote her as shrill, power-crazed, and disruptive. But if you read between the lines, if you ignore the gossip and listen for the facts, a different Fulvia emerges. She was the first Roman woman to put her name on coins, to build political factions, to wield marriage as a tactical weapon, and to orchestrate street politics with a deftness that left senators sweating through their togas. She moved through the chaos of Rome's civil wars, not as a background figure, but as a player, a woman whose influence terrified the establishment and shaped the fate of Rome's triumvirs. Fulvia's downfall wasn't the result of failure. It was a matter of timing, and more than anything, gender. Had she been born a man, perhaps we'd remember her as a second Caesar, or a more charming Cato. Instead, she was condemned for the simple crime of reaching too far while female. But even in defeat, her legacy quietly smouldered. Later Roman women, Livia Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and from another world entirely, Cleopatra, would learn from Fulvia's example. They would manipulate emperors, command armies, and steer the course of empires, but Fulvia did it first, and without the armor of an imperial title. Today, Fulvia's reputation is getting a long overdue makeover. Modern historians, armed with skepticism and a fondness for inconvenient facts, are taking a second look. No longer a cautionary tale, Fulvia is being recognized as one of the most politically active and daring women in Roman history, a woman who tested the boundaries of power, paid the price, and left her mark anyway. She didn't just live in the age of the triumvirs. She challenged them, outmaneuvered them, and for a moment bent Rome to her will. Rome tried to erase her, but Fulvia left fingerprints everywhere, on coins, in letters, and in the panic of senators who realized too late that the weaker sex could be a force of nature. Not a footnote, but a force, centuries ahead of her time. And then, as if history couldn't resist a good plot twist, we leap forward across time and continents. By the summer of 1963, the United States found itself at a crossroads not so different from Rome 2,000 years before. America was a country splitting at the seams, caught between an old world built on segregation and a new one straining to be born. In the Deep South, segregation wasn't just a social custom, it was law. Black Americans were forbidden from eating at certain restaurants, attending white schools, riding wherever they pleased on buses, stepping into polling booths, or even drinking from the wrong fountain. Police violence was rampant, lynchings still haunted the countryside. In places like Birmingham, Alabama, peaceful protesters were met with attack dogs and the blast of fire hoses, as if the city had confused civil rights with a particularly violent car wash. But change was coming, and it wasn't asking for an invitation. In just a handful of years, the civil rights movement had elbowed its way into the national spotlight. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and boycotts filled the headlines. Names like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and John Lewis became not just people, but living symbols of a movement. The March on Washington wasn't born from a single flash of inspiration. It was the product of mounting frustration and a stubborn hope that refused to die. Black Americans were tired of waiting. They were determined to be heard, loudly, unmistakably, and in the one place where it might finally matter, the nation's capital. The idea of a mass march on Washington had been floating around for decades. Back in the 1940s, Labor leader and civil rights pioneer A. Philip Randolph had pitched the idea as a way to pressure President Roosevelt into desegregating the defense industry. That particular protest was called off after the president blinked first and signed an executive order. But by 1963, the stakes were higher, the dreams bolder. Randolph, along with Bayard Rustin, an organizational genius with a penchant for bow ties, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., revived the vision. This time, the march wasn't just about jobs. It was about dignity, voting rights, desegregation, equal pay, and, above all, the simple right to live without fear. More than a dozen major civil rights organizations, often at odds over tactics and egos, managed to unite for one purpose. They all understood, divided. They were easy to ignore. United, they could shake the country's conscience. Flyers appeared everywhere. Buses were chartered, and word of mouth outpaced the morning papers. Across the country, Black Americans readied themselves for a moment that would become seared into history. A march built one conversation, one shoe, and one unbreakable dream at a time. Now, if you've ever tried to organize a family reunion and ended up with a headache, imagine planning a peaceful protest in Washington, D.C. for more than 100,000 people. The logistics alone could make a Roman general weep. Food, water, transportation, sound systems, bathrooms, medical teams, permits, crowd control, safety plans. The to-do list was biblical. And yet, they pulled it off. At the heart of the operation stood Bayard Rustin, a man whose resume included everything from studying non-violence in India to being jailed, beaten, and tailed by the FBI. Rustin, despite being sidelined by his own allies for being openly gay, was a master strategist. He saw the march as a chance to prove that disciplined, non-violent protest could change the world, provided it was run with the precision of a military operation. In just 8 weeks, Rustin and his team turned a bold idea into reality. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was born, a name that made it clear this was about both racial justice and economic opportunity. That dual message wasn't an accident. While Dr. King would become the moral voice of the day, it was Randolph and Rustin who made sure the movement's demands included unemployment, minimum wage, and workers' rights alongside civil rights. But under the surface, nerves crackled. President Kennedy and his administration were anxious, deeply anxious. They feared riots, backlash, or worse. The National Guard was on standby, Hospitals were quietly put on alert. Liquor sales were banned for the day, a move that, in DC, bordered on revolutionary. Even federal workers were told to stay home, just in case the capital needed to be emptied at a moment's notice. And then there was the matter of unity. The so-called Big Six civil rights organizations, NAACP, CORE, SNCC, SCLC, the National Urban League, and Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, were legendary for their disagreements. Some leaders pushed for radical action, others for cautious diplomacy. SNCC's young firebrands grew impatient with King's non-violent approach, but they all agreed on one thing: the time for silence was over. Rustin's plan was as detailed as a Roman battle map. Every bus and train was tracked, every speaker was timed, every route had marshals trained in crowd control. This wasn't just a march. It was a moment engineered to jolt the conscience of the nation, a kind of peaceful siege on the capital, staged not with swords or shields, but with songs, speeches, and a dream that refused to be erased. And so, as one woman's legacy faded into the hush of exile, another generation prepared to raise its voice in the heart of American power. The road to the march was paved with heartbreak, hope, and the kind of stubborn courage that history never quite manages to bury. A dream was about to echo through the ages, as August 28, 1963 approached. August 28, 1963, a Wednesday, so thick with humidity that even the shadows seemed to sweat. Picture Washington, D.C., already shimmering by 9 in the morning. The air was heavy, the sun relentless, and if you'd ever doubted that wool suits were invented by sadists, today was Exhibit A. Yet the heat didn't matter. Not to the flood of people pouring into the city from every direction. If you'd stood there with me, yes, I was present. Disguised as a volunteer with an unusually modern wristwatch, you'd have seen a kaleidoscope of faces, men and women, black and white, teenagers and grandparents, teachers, steel workers, preachers and movie stars. Some looked like they'd stepped out of a Sunday service, others like they'd just finished a shift at the factory. They arrived by the hundreds, then thousands, and then hundreds of thousands, rolling in on buses that rattled like medieval beds, on trains, in car caravans, and yes, a few even walked the final miles. By noon, the National Mall had become a living river of humanity, over 250,000 strong, all surging toward a single purpose, as if hope itself had grown legs and decided to march. Now, if the government was expecting chaos, they must have been sorely disappointed. There were no riots, no mayhem, not even a hint of the pandemonium that officials had braced for. Instead, what unfolded was almost unnervingly peaceful. Volunteers, some of whom had probably never directed anything more complicated than a church bake sale, were suddenly orchestrating the world's largest game of human Tetris. The Red Cross distributed water and, thankfully, not medieval sleeping sacks. Gospel choirs broke into song by the reflecting pool, their voices soaring above the chatter, while chants for jobs and freedom bounced off the white marble of the Lincoln Memorial. At one point I found myself next to a cluster of students singing "We Shall Overcome," with such conviction that even the pigeons seemed moved. And yes, celebrities were there too. Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan. The list was a who's who of 1960s cool, but nobody was clamoring for autographs. These stars were not the main attraction. They were supporting cast in a story far bigger than themselves. Every attendee, famous or otherwise, seemed to instinctively understand that they were here to witness something monumental. It wasn't a rally or a protest as much as it was a collective act of devotion. For many black Americans, just standing on that mall in sight of the stone Lincoln felt like a quiet, stubborn revolution. To be seen, counted, and heard on the same steps where freedom had once been promised, well, that was its own kind of victory. When the clock struck noon, the official program began. One by one, leaders took the stage, each representing different organizations, ideologies, and corners of the country. But at that moment, all those differences melted away. The message was united. Demands for equal pay, for integrated schools, for a living wage, for an end to police violence. Mahalia Jackson sang so powerfully that I'm convinced a few security guards quietly wept behind their sunglasses. Marian Anderson, once barred from Constitution Hall because of her race, now performed for thousands beneath the open sky, her voice echoing across the moor like a benediction. As the hours ticked by, the tension didn't come from fear or unrest. It came from anticipation, the slowly building certainty that something extraordinary was about to happen. And everyone knew who they were waiting for. Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., the man with the calm voice and the fire in his eyes. When he finally approached the podium, the crowd hushed. Even the cicadas seemed to pause their racket. King wore a dark suit, every line of it pressed with the weight of history, and beneath his calm exterior, you could sense a storm gathering. He carried prepared remarks, the product of late-night collaboration, and more than one heated debate. But as he began to speak, it quickly became clear that paper would only be his starting point. He opened with a measured, almost surgical indictment of America's broken promises. 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, he declared, Black Americans were still not free. His voice rose and fell with the cadence of a sermon, each phrase deliberate, each pause loaded. The crowd listened in absolute silence, some nodding, some wiping away tears, others gripping handmade signs as if they were life preservers. And then, a moment that would become legend. Just behind King stood Mahalia Jackson, the gospel singer whose voice had already electrified the crowd. She called out, urgent and clear, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." I remember the ripple that ran through the crowd. King set his notes aside, gripped the podium, and whining us without warning, let history loose. "I have a dream," he said, and the air trembled. He spoke of a nation rising up, of sons of former slaves and slave owners sitting together at the table of brotherhood. He dreamed aloud of a world where his 4 children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Each repetition of "I have a dream" thundered across the crowd, a drumbeat that seemed to shake the very stones of the memorial. It was no longer a speech. It was prophecy, vision, and collective prayer all at once. By the time King closed with the words, "Free at last," free at last, thank God Almighty we are free at last, the crowd erupted. People hugged strangers, wept openly, cheered and raised their signs high enough to blot out the sun. It was a moment so electric that even the most cynical government agents, yes, I saw you FBI, couldn't help but be swept up, if only for a second. But let's not forget, the true power of the March on Washington wasn't just in the music or the oratory, it was in the people themselves. The sheer immensity of the crowd was staggering. They'd come from every corner of the country. Mississippi, Michigan, Alabama, New York, California. Each state, each city, each small town sent its delegation. Some were seasoned activists, veterans of a dozen marches. Others had never left their hometowns until now. Many packed sandwiches, rode buses for 20 hours or more, and in a running theme of historical discomfort, slept in their church clothes or on pews the night before, just to claim their spot on the mall. Ordinary folks, maids, teachers, postal clerks, steel workers became living witnesses to history. They weren't just demanding change, they embodied it. And the children. Oh, the children. Little girls in dresses with bright ribbons, boys with carefully lettered signs and hopeful grins. Parents hoisted their toddlers onto their shoulders so they could catch a glimpse of the distant Lincoln Memorial and hear the words that would echo long after they'd returned home. For those children, this day wasn't just a chapter in a textbook. It was the first day of a new world, a world they believed could finally be different. Some faces stood out more than others. John Lewis, a mere 23 years old, representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, wore a seriousness that belied his youth. His speech, originally so fiery it threatened to set them all ablaze, had been toned down at the 11th hour, but it still rattled the crowd with its uncompromising call for change. Daisy Bates, the only woman to speak that day, didn't take the stage for herself, but read a brief, powerful statement on behalf of the movement's women. It was a necessary reminder that even within a march for equality, some voices still struggled to be fully heard. The crowd was a tapestry of unity and diversity. Union organizers, rabbis in yarmulkes, nuns in full habit, college students and grandparents who'd seen more history than they cared to. Not everyone agreed on tactics. Some leaned toward King's doctrine of nonviolence. Others, inspired by Malcolm X, favored more radical action. But for one day, those divisions faded. Solidarity, not strategy, ruled. The mall became a living mosaic of possibility. White and black hands linked together, Freedom Now buttons flashed in the sunlight, and the low, steady hum of 250,000 people daring to believe as one. From above, the scene was breathtaking, but it was the feeling in the air that would stick with you, the sense that, just for a moment, America's better angels were winning. Of course, what the world saw on TV, the unity, the inspiration, the poetic justice, was only the public face of the march. Behind the scenes, things were more complicated. The so-called perfect choreography was, in reality, a barely contained whirlwind of last-minute negotiations and frantic improvisation. Bayard Rustin, the march's chief architect, spent the day juggling logistics, personalities, and a constant barrage of political threats. Rustin's life was a tangle of controversy. He was openly gay, a former communist, and as a result, under relentless scrutiny from both friends and foes. Some civil rights leaders feared his past would be used to discredit the movement entirely. In fact, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell once threatened to accuse Rustin and King of being lovers unless Rustin was removed from a prior campaign. That threat lingered over every meeting and phone call leading up to the march. And then there was the issue of women's voices. Women like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height had been instrumental in planning and organizing, yet none were invited to deliver a major solo speech. Even Rosa Parks, whose quiet act of resistance helped spark the movement, was in the crowd, honored but not given the microphone. The optics were powerful, but the reality was still imperfect, a movement for justice, still learning justice within itself. Inside the so-called Big Six organizations, friction simmered. Younger activists, especially from SNCC, were growing impatient with the slow pace of progress and the older generation's penchant for moderation. Some wanted to take more aggressive steps to confront systemic racism head-on. The Congress of Racial Equality shared similar frustrations, but if only for that one day, unity trumped dissent. The cracks in the coalition were patched over, at least until the speeches were done. Meanwhile, the ever-watchful eye of the federal government was fixed on the proceedings. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had deployed more than 100 agents to shadow organizers, bug hotel rooms, and compile dossiers thick enough to serve as doorstops. They were convinced the march would devolve into violence or, at the very least, serve as a platform for communist infiltration. When neither happened, the Bureau simply doubled down on surveillance, especially targeting Dr. King. I'd like to imagine at least one agent was briefly moved by King's words before returning to his tape recorder. There were other headaches too, like the budget. The march cost over $250,000, a sum that would make any modern event planner break out in hives. Most of it was scraped together from unions and sympathetic donors, but the money only came together at the last minute. Walkie-talkies were borrowed from the Boy Scouts, and the entire operation ran on a mix of idealism, caffeine, and sheer nerve. In the end, the March on Washington was exactly what America needed it to be. Historic, yes, but also deeply, stubbornly human. It was messy, political, unfinished. It was the kind of day that proves history isn't made by perfect people, but by ordinary folks determined to do something extraordinary. Even if they have to improvise the details as they go. The sun began its slow descent behind the Washington Monument, casting long shadows across the mall as people lingered, reluctant to leave sacred ground. There were hugs, songs, tears, and the kind of quiet conversations you only have when you know you've just seen the world shift, if only a little. The speeches were over, the banners lowered, and the world, having watched, waited to see what would come next. And as the last of the crowd drifted away, and the echoes of the dream faded into the muggy August twilight, a new question settled over the city like dew. What now? What would tomorrow bring? That's where our story leads next. In the immediate days that followed, the media reaction was cautiously positive. The response from the press arrived with the careful politeness of someone inspecting a neighbor's garden. Interested but wary of stepping on the prize roses, headlines trumpeted the sheer size and peacefulness of the crowd, as if the true miracle was how no one tripped over the reflecting pool or started a riot. Editors used words like dignified and orderly, which, in the coded language of the time, mostly meant that nobody toppled the Lincoln Memorial or threw a punch in front of the cameras. The specific demands, calls for a federal jobs program or a living wage that would hover around $20 an hour in today's money, were tucked into the margins, barely mentioned. But Dr. King's speech, that thunderous moment on the steps, was impossible to ignore. Every paper, every radio recap, every newscast had to reckon with his voice echoing across the mall, carving a place in history whether they wanted it or not. Meanwhile, watching from the comfort of the Oval Office, President John F. Kennedy, who'd originally regarded the idea of the march with all the enthusiasm of someone facing a surprise pop quiz, found himself unexpectedly moved. You could almost picture him, perched in front of a flickering television, eyebrows rising as the peaceful crowds defied his nervous expectations. He called the march impressive, a word that in presidential dialect translates roughly to, "Well, that didn't go nearly as badly as I feared." He invited the civil rights leaders to the White House for a meeting that very evening. Yet, for all the handshakes and photo ops, movement in Congress was about as swift as medieval peasants rising from their straw mattresses after a night of tossing and turning. The Civil Rights Act he championed remained stuck, mired in the quicksand of Southern resistance and legislative foot-dragging. For many activists, the day after the march felt like waking from an exhilarating dream only to find the same old grind waiting outside the door. There had been hope that the sheer scale and power of the march would force immediate change, that the gears of justice would finally start turning. Instead, it was back to organizing, marching, writing letters, and mourning those who never made it home. The reality of the struggle came crashing back with brutal clarity just weeks later. On September 15th, 1963, a bomb ripped through the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, killing 4 little girls as they prepared for Sunday service. The dream had been spoken aloud, but the nightmare, it seemed, was far from over. Yet, even as tragedy threatened to drown hope, something fundamental had shifted. The March on Washington became a line drawn in the sand, a signal that mass protest could be disciplined, resolute, and utterly impossible to dismiss. It wasn't just the sheer number of people that mattered, but the diversity, the way labor unions, clergy, celebrities, students, and working folks from every corner of the nation stood shoulder to shoulder, united by a simple demand for justice. The movement found its voice that day, a voice that would resound in classrooms, pulpits, and living rooms across the world. The march ended, but the journey was only beginning. The road ahead would be long, winding through heartbreak, legislative battles, and eventually transformation. The march didn't just nudge the conscience of America, it cracked the moral landscape, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths. An event that began as a daring act of protest became the cornerstone of a movement, reshaping what Americans believed about justice, democracy, and the sheer stubborn power of collective action. Sure, the legislative victories weren't immediate, but the march built momentum, and history doesn't always move at the speed we expect. Less than a year later, in July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson would sign the Civil Rights Act. That document outlawed segregation in public spaces and banned employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The next year, the Voting Rights Act landed, finally delivering a crushing blow to the Jim Crow laws that had strangled democracy for generations. Would these laws have passed without the march? Maybe. But would they have carried the same weight, the same urgency, the same moral thunder? That seems unlikely. For Martin Luther King Jr., the march marked a turning point. He crossed from respected leader into the realm of international icon, his words repeated from schoolrooms in Atlanta to parliaments abroad. But fame, as it so often does, brought new dangers, surveillance, threats, and eventually the ultimate price. His assassination in 1968 rendered the words "I have a dream" even more poignant, even more tragic, the dream itself growing in stature with every passing year. For the movement as a whole, the march offered proof that unity, real, messy, complicated unity, could achieve the impossible. It gave organizers a playbook for future mobilization and inspired a generation of activists in the US and beyond. Anti-apartheid leaders in South Africa, student demonstrators in Europe, and human rights campaigners everywhere would later point to that day in Washington as their template, proof that peaceful resistance could shift the tides of history. But the legacy of the march doesn't belong solely to the past. Its language, its imagery, Its fierce hope echoes through every modern protest. Whether it's the Million Man March, Black Lives Matter rallies, or any other call for justice that winds through the streets of Washington, you can hear the refrain of 1963 in every chant, see it in every handmade sign. Dr. King's memorial now stands just across the water from Lincoln's, his stone likeness gazing out at the city, words from that summer day carved deep into granite. But the truest memorial, the one that matters most, isn't a statue. It's found in classrooms where kids read his speech, in voting booths where rights are claimed, in marches where voices refuse to be silenced. The dream wasn't meant to gather dust in history books. It was meant to be lived, argued over, and fought for. 60 years have slipped by since that summer afternoon when more than 250,000 people gathered beneath the statue of Lincoln, baking in the August heat. The March on Washington has since been frozen in time, in textbooks, documentaries, and the endless loop of black and white newsreels. King's words, steady and clear, are now etched in the American memory, invoked like a national prayer. And yet, the question lingers, floating in the humid air. Has the dream come true, or is it still out of reach, flickering on the horizon? In many ways, progress is undeniable. The legal machinery of segregation was dismantled. Voting rights, though now facing new threats in some states, were won through blood, persistence, and unyielding courage. The sight of black lawmakers, judges, mayors, and even a two-term president would have been unthinkable in 1963. Interracial marriage, once a criminal act in much of the country, is now a protected right. These are not small victories. They are the hard-earned trophies of relentless struggle. And yet the original demands of the march, the ones that rarely make the highlight reel, still haunt us. The call for a living wage remains unanswered. Racial gaps in education, housing, employment, and healthcare stubbornly persist. Police brutality, the very injustice that first sparked so much organizing, continues to fill headlines and drive protest. The dream of true economic justice, a nation where your opportunities aren't limited by your zip code or by the color of your skin, remains unfinished business. Today, modern movements like Black Lives Matter have inherited both the spirit and the challenge of 1963. They march the same streets, brandish the same banners, and demand the same basic rights. But they do so in a world transformed by smartphones and surveillance, hashtags and live streams, new tools for an old fight. The March on Washington was never intended as the final chapter. It was a flashpoint, a line drawn in the sand, a declaration that said, "This is who we are, and this is what we demand." Not a resolution, but a dare to the future. So the dream endures, battered, sometimes distorted, always debated, but alive. Whether it is fulfilled, deferred, or rewritten depends on us, on what we choose to confront, on whether we're willing to march, to speak, and to keep pushing until that dream is a reality we can all share. So as you close your textbooks or scroll past another grainy photo of that summer day, ask yourself, what would you have done then? And what are you ready to do now to make sure the echoes of that dream don't fade away, but grow louder with each new generation?